Let's talk recruiting, Badger fans. Is the 2026 class going to measure up to what the Badgers did in 24 or 25? That's coming up next. Locked On Badgers.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ryan Harings. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. There's no better way to make every play more exciting than FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers bet $5 and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Today's episode, we are talking about the 2026 football class. Is it going to measure up to the 24-25 classes? Greg Gard, is the criticism still warranted, or do people just need to chill there? And what's the ceiling on this team? And then Billy Edwards Jr., where does he rank in the Big Ten in this upcoming season in starting quarterbacks? Today's show, as I've been doing lately, every show is unofficially brought to you by a Badger player. Today's show is brought to you by Chris Presley, unofficially, and that is a fullback. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the picture from back there. That is a fullback's fullback. If you're too young to know Chris Presley, go back and watch some of that man in the weight room or on the field. All right, let's get into it. We got Connor Whelan joining the show. Writes for Bucky's Fifth Quarter. Really good guy. He's been on before. Good feedback from the last time. So, Connor, thank you for jumping on. I want to start here, man, because I know you're very into recruiting. 2026 class. We're kind of shifting gears. We had a junior day recently. Do you think that class just in general is going to measure up to the last two?
It's a really good question, Ryan. I think that it can definitely measure up to 2024 class just because I think with all the moving parts, with I think Chris leaving kind of around that time and everything else going on in the program, I don't think that shaped up to be as good as a class as I think Fickell may have hoped. But I think definitely 2025 might be a little bit of a step ahead just because they were able to flip those key recruits like Jalen Williams and Carter Smith from Michigan, which are really two huge gets for the Badgers. And I feel like I don't know if any single player in this class can live up to the kind of the prowess that this class kind of has already established itself with.
Who are some key guys you're tracking in the 26 class?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones I'd look at is Amari Latimer. I think his brother is. I think is it Heimer? I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it?
The cornerback from Jacksonville State.
Yeah.
Coming in. Yep.
Yeah, and he'll be a huge player this year for the Badgers especially, but I think that also does give them a leg up in Latimer's recruitment, obviously. But I think that'll be an interesting year because that'll be kind of the bridge running back between the Jones and Dupree era, if I'm kind of thinking correctly, along lines of what Grimes and Fickell kind of going to scheme-wise at running back. So I think he's kind of an interesting prospect. But I also like some of the quarterbacks that they've been offering recently. I know that they were talking to Ryan Hopkins. I saw something on Twitter the other day that they were in contact with him, and then even Peyton Falzone was at the Oregon game, I believe. And both those quarterback prospects are pretty intriguing. I feel like those could be some guys where they sit for a couple of years, and if they stay with the program, could be the starter a couple of years down the road. So those are some guys that stand out to me.
Just on the quarterback, let's stick there for a second. You talked about Carter Smith last year. Bo Bentley, another guy they're talking to in the 2026 class that is pretty athletic. How many scholarship quarterbacks? This question came up the other day. I'm curious. How many scholarship quarterbacks can you get in the NIL era in a room? Because Fickell said, I want 5. That feels almost impossible to me in this era.
That's a good question. I feel like it depends on how highly ranked the quarterback is. You feel me? I feel like sometimes quarterbacks might feel like they deserve to be the guy at a program. And I feel like Carter Smith is Wisconsin's guy at the moment. I don't know if they're able to recruit one of his caliber every single season because that's promising too many people a role that you just don't have that many roles to give out. So I feel like they might be able to get some of those low 4 stars that know that maybe down the road they can become a starter. I kind of look at Garrett Nussmeier was at LSU. He was a pretty highly ranked player out of high school. He sat behind Jaden Daniels for 2 or 3 years and then finally got his time to shine against the Badgers in the Raw Quest Bowl and actually started this year and was pretty great. And he's one of the favorites to win the Heisman in this upcoming season. So I think it just shows that with time, I think a lot of quarterbacks can develop even if it's not fully mid-game.
Yeah, and with that quarterback development, obviously Grimes coming in. Did you like the shift up on the coaching staff? I'm kind of shotgunning you this, but we're talking quarterbacks, and I know there wasn't a traditional quarterbacks coach with Guyton moving over. How did you feel about that shift on the offensive side?
I really like it. I think a lot of the most talented offense coordinators in recent memory, or at least recent memory that kind of emulate what the Wisconsin wants to be like, are guys like Mike Denbrock, who Luke Fickell worked with previously at Cincinnati, and he was not ever a quarterbacks coach as well as an offensive coordinator. He was mainly an offensive line guy and also a tight ends coach for a bit. So I think having those kind of ground and pound kind of guys like Jeff Grimes that kind of want to reestablish the run at a school like Wisconsin kind of, I guess, fits the build that they're trying to build. But I also think that having a guy like Kenny Guyton, who was already on staff and players already really liked him, so you're not losing any of the connections that they had with him, while also bringing in more of a skill set of, hey, he played quarterback in the past. That's more of the position he's better suited for. Switching him to that position is pretty, I guess, a pretty smooth transition, in my opinion. I think so far you've seen he's done some great job with the offers. I believe we were talking about earlier. Bo Bentley was one of his offers, and that just shows that I think he and Fickell might have a different look at quarterback than what Longo and Fickell did. So kind of shifting from the air raid to maybe the more dual threat type of guys.
Yeah, it's a good point, because you look at a guy like Jared Mock, who had been committed to the Badgers and Longo, and they cut bait with him, clearly looking for a very different type of quarterback. I think you could argue maybe selfishly you should have kept a guy on the hook until you got somebody else in the bush, but I mean, they're very clearly looking for somebody else. I want to see this, continue talking recruiting. I feel like this is a really big year for receivers and running backs in the recruiting cycle. They didn't pick up a running back last year. You mentioned you need a bridge guy from this Darrion, Dupree, Dilon Jones era. And also receivers. They got 2 receivers in the last 2 years with Kyrie Johnson and Eugene Hilton. It feels like they got to load up at least a couple guys at each spot potentially this cycle.
Definitely. I think you can see, I'm just going through the 24/7 offers list for 2026 right now, and there's a lot more offers out to running backs and receivers in this cycle than last cycle. And you can even see, like, Sean Alston announced at the All-American Bowl. I know that Wisconsin wasn't able to land his commitment, but it just shows that they were in deep in these final kind of 3 or 4 schools for a lot of players. And they probably will continue to be that way because they're trying to kind of move to more of a skill position focus in this cycle, especially with the running backs, but also with wide receivers. And they're trying to get guys like, is it Naeem Burrows? I know, I think I'm pronouncing that correct. Obviously, they're trying to get him. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but even offering guys like Tristan Keys from just out of high school, but also Jordan Reed, it was just kind of his first offer as coach. I think that was kind of interesting that they're targeting some of the higher ranked receivers instead of the lower ranked guys that I think Longo is kind of focusing on.
Yeah, it feels like Reed is coming in with some recruiting energy, right? Like, yeah, I think that's almost why he's going to be here. Come recruit your butt off. You're young, energetic, relates to both players. I've heard really good things there. He's the type of guy that might get more talent on the edges. And I think receiver, and I'm curious your take on this, receiver to me, that's one of those spots where if you have to pick one or the other, I would prefer a recruiter as a coach. Like, you just need to bring talent in there.
I agree. I think you've seen it with Brian Hartline in Ohio State, that a lot of the guys that are top receivers, they pan out right away. Like Jeremiah Smith, #1 recruit in the country. He ended up being the best receiver in the country first year he was there. And even guys like Marvin Harrison, as a freshman, he played in the Rose Bowl, and I think he had nearly 200 yards. Like these guys that come in with these kind of high prospect and everything like that, they come in with a lot of skill sets. Not like much needs to be taught for them. Obviously, blocking and some of those, I guess, more fundamental skills will come as time goes on, but just the catching prowess and stuff like that kind of already comes from the jump. So those 5 stars and even high 4 stars can come in and be a starter from day one.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where those guys have skill development coaches year round. Like the things that you used to do as a coach in the 70s and 80s, even 90s, I don't know exactly when this flip switched, but they're doing it year round now. They're going to camps, clinics, they're working with skill development guys. When a freshman comes in, it's to learn the offense. It's not to learn how to play receiver necessarily, in my opinion. And I think that's where a guy like Coach Reed could be a big deal.
No, you're right. I think especially quarterback, the issue with quarterback is that in high school, quarterbacks don't usually get used nearly as much as they will in college. You look at the stat lines of guys like Jaron Mock, who Wisconsin offered, and obviously he committed to. His stat lines would be like 7 for 8. That's just not much passing experience in game. And I'm not saying that he's not a talented passer. I think he's a very good player, but it just shows that the receivers that are being fed the ball every single play clearly have a lot more experience and kind of in-game, I guess, like I said, experience than the quarterbacks might, just because they're kind of more of a focal point of the offenses.
I want to finish up our recruiting football talk with this question. And it's very much a world of like, what's next in recruiting? Like there's this constant need to what's next? Who's the next player? Who's the next commit? And then you forget about last year's class pretty quickly. Who in that 25 class do you think plays early? Like who's the guy you circle and say that guy's playing right away this year?
That's a good question. I think I was a little surprised at how little receivers they targeted out of the portal. I know they got guys like Mark Hamper and Jaden Ballard from the portal, but I was expecting them to get, I guess, one more guy. And so that kind of, I guess, bridges to my point is that I think Eugene Hilton could be a guy that really plays right away, because you hear what Kenny Guyton said about him. And I know he's moving to quarterbacks coach, but I think that only helps his development because he'll kind of have an inside ear to Grimes and the quarterback room. And I think it just shows that they really like what Hilton has. And I think the fact that Hilton stayed with the program despite being recruited by guys like Longo just shows that he's bought into the principles and idea that Fickell has kind of preached to these recruits. And I feel like a guy of his name, like everyone knows T.Y. Hilton, it kind of feels like a no-brainer that he'd maybe be an impact guy from day one, even if it's not, even if it's like a Tretch Kahuna role from this year where he has one game where he just goes completely all out and just shows his potential. That just feels like that could be definitely his role this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one because that's not a logjam. Like if you're, listen, there's talent there. Like you mentioned Hamper, I think is enrolled there. Maybe Quincy Burrows takes a step up. Maybe a guy like Chris Brooks with the new offensive coordinator takes a step up, but that is not Ohio State's boundary receiver room. And Eugene Hilton Jr. definitely has some talent there. All right, we're going to take a quick second. We're going to come back, talk about Greg Gard. Does the criticism just kind of need to shut off for a while with Greg Gard and the people that have been vocal about his coaching? That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick second for our friends of the show over at FanDuel. FanDuel is the number one source for all your sports betting needs. Again, Super Bowl 59 is coming up. Right now, there is not a better time to get onto FanDuel. Make every play more exciting with FanDuel Sportsbook, whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss. FanDuel makes it easy to get in on all the action with live betting all game long. You can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to final whistle. I love that it's just simple. It's easy. The payouts are secure. They're quick. I've talked about my first betting experience before where even if I won, it felt like I was never really going to get paid because I think the money was routing around all sorts of third world, former Russian bloc countries. FanDuel's simple. You can trust it. It's like your grandma. It's trustworthy. Download the app. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet $5 if you win. You'll get $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. All right, let's get back into this. Bring Connor back in. Also, thank you to everybody tuning in for sure. All right, Connor, I want to talk to you about Greg Gard because it feels like there's this block of people, and for right or wrong, I'm not saying it's wrong, who aren't going to let off of some of the criticism they've had with Greg Gard until he makes a deep run into March. Is that fair? Or do you also just need to at some point say, man, this team is 17th in the country after losing Hepburn, Wall, and AJ Storr last year?
It's a good question. I think the bigger thing for me is how he rebounded from losing those guys to the portal was the biggest thing for me. And I think at the time, I don't think people were as happy because guys like Amos and Tanjay and Cam Hunter weren't super high on the rankings of transfer portal players. But you look at them now. I mean, I guess Hunter hasn't played much, but Amos has been a decent player off the bench. And guys like Tanjay have been one of the best players in the Big Ten. So I feel like the fact that he was able to find these under the radar guys without much, and he didn't get much credit in the offseason for that. They were like, oh, his seat's kind of heating up a bit. So I feel like that gives him a little bit of a, I guess, pass for me. But also I feel like the fact is a lot of the issues that were happening in February and late in the year weren't always due to him. I think a lot of them happened to really unfortunate injuries that would happen to the team. I remember last year, Kamari McGee's injury kind of hurt this team more than I think people realized, because I remember the first game that he came back, I felt like there was just a breath of fresh air from this entire team. It just felt like they were so rejuvenated from just such a bad stretch. And same thing, I remember Johnny Davis got banged up. He wasn't fully out for a ton of time, but you could tell that he was not himself. And I feel like those two stretches didn't help, I guess, the doubters and critics around him kind of silence them. But I feel like this year, this team is a lot better positioned to make a run than even last year where they looked pretty good. I feel like just they're more efficient offensively, and I feel like the defense is coming around by the end of the season, whereas last year I felt like the defense started, but it started to kind of falter as the season went on.
Yeah, and you're right on that Johnny Davis thing. Like, he had banged up his ankle, and you could tell it was like he was out there because he was a warrior, if nothing else, but he was like 80% of Johnny Davis. It just wasn't there. I continue to say this. I think March Madness is incredible, and it's super important. It matters. People who are critical of Wisconsin taking early L's there, that's valid. I also think March, that can be one of the more overrated things in college basketball. For a long time, Lute Olson, who was a Hall of Fame coach at Arizona, was criticized for never making a run until he did, and he won a title. Bo Ryan, for a lot of years, was criticized for this. Matt Painter in the past has been criticized for this. Sean Miller's never been to a Final Four, I don't believe. He's one of the best coaches in college basketball. I just think, man, you have to keep putting really good teams together in the regular season. And if you have proven to do that, you're an upper echelon coach. And eventually you break through in March is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going to bring another coach up is Tony Bennett. My dad went to Virginia, so I was very familiar with the Bennetts, and I know that was a big deal in 2018 when they got upset by UMBC, as people thought he could never win the big game, I guess, and they kind of proved that wrong in 2019. But then the doubters started happening again in the 2020s because they made the tournament, I believe, 3 times in the 2020s and never made it out of the first round. It's something that you're going to have to give because you won a championship, but that is frustrating. But also the fact is that there was a lot of hidden things going on with that as well. A lot of the times, like in 2020, I remember UVA got COVID and they weren't able to practice for 2 weeks for the tournament. That didn't help. Before one of the games, I remember that one of their players went down. It's just a lot of stuff that's out of their control. And while March Madness is a great tournament, it's not always where you can prove sustained success. And I feel like the fact that Greg Gard has already won the Big Ten multiple times in his tenure, and he's been the Big Ten Coach of the Year multiple times, just shows that his peers really respect him. So I just feel like even last year when people were saying they should fire Greg Gard, it just wasn't very serious just because people really respect him around the league and the country. And it was clear this year that when he got the right players and the right caliber offensive scheme, that he can really make something special happen. I feel like this will happen this year. I'm not trying to jinx it. I'll knock on wood for that. But I do think this team is very capable of making a run deep into March.
Yeah, I think this team is better positioned to make a run. I will say, to be fair too, like you can't lose to a 12 seed the way you did. I think that is a valid criticism. Like that game was over before it started for whatever reason. But ultimately, he was a 5 seed, and it looks like we're tracking for another 5 seed with almost a completely new offensive scheme and half the roster turned over. That's a chip in his shoulder, or chip in his back pocket, the feather in his cap. I don't know where I'm going with this now. We'll go feather in the cap. Let me ask you this, though. So you wrote about the UCLA game that the Badgers lost, some of the reasons why that happened. Do you think that game was more of a UCLA thing, or do you think that was a self-inflicted Wisconsin thing? In other words, can other teams replicate what UCLA did against us?
I mean, I'm big on the numbers. I think if you read my stuff, I'm very big into KenPom efficiency, stuff like that. And I think some people don't like that, but if you look at the numbers, KenPom is usually 90 to 95% accurate on predicting games. And even in March, they'll tell you which teams might be upset early. And that was a game that KenPom said Wisconsin only had a 39% chance of winning. So while I predicted them to win in my article, I knew that it was very, very possible that Wisconsin would get upset. On the road in the Big Ten is never easy. UCLA is a pretty difficult place to win. And also the fact is that UCLA was playing so poorly for so long that they finally kind of broke through against Iowa. It kind of became clear that they kind of had a new, I guess, feeling of life in their basketball squad. And they guys like Kobe Johnson looked fired up. And as Ade Mero was the guy that kind of coached Wisconsin in that game, and he seemed like he was fired up too. So I do think that there were things that Wisconsin can work on in the game. I think in the beginning of the game, they let UCLA get out to way too hot of a lead, and I think that was Wisconsin playing a little bit too complacent when it comes to defense. But when it comes to offense, they scored 83 points against one of the better defenses in the Big Ten. I'm not really frustrated about that, and I will say is that that's a team that preseason, no one would have thought Wisconsin would have had a chance to win. The fact that it was a 2-point game when I guess even the spread was like UCLA -4, it just shows that they did better than even the expectation. So I'm not trying to excuse the loss. I think that they really should have won that game, and that with the end of the game was getting a little bit rough. But I do think that the way that it was ending, there was so much ticky-tack fouls. It's one of those games that it becomes just a toss-up. So you can't really expect to win all those games, especially when it's on the road.
Yeah, and I love what you just said there. Like, you're not going to win all the toss-ups. At the end of the year, I felt like we should have won the Michigan game, but if we had won that game, I guarantee you Michigan would have said, man, I felt like we should have won the Wisconsin game. Like, that's just how it works, right? There's so many games that can go either way, and it's decided by a possession or two, oftentimes a possession or two in the middle of the game, not even at the end.
But even what you're saying is right. I think even the Michigan game is probably a bigger deal for Wisconsin because it was at home. In that game, they shot really inefficiently from 3. I remember Max Klesmit did not have his best game. In this UCLA game, Tanjay was 8 for 9 from the field or something crazy. I don't remember. Quote me if I'm wrong, but I think it was something crazy like that. He wasn't used much in the second half. There are things that you can obviously fix in the future game plans, but it was clear that Wisconsin was making their shots. Blackwell had one of his best games of the season, and it was just one where UCLA was just hotter, and that's something that you kind of have to live with. And I like the thing about this team is that it felt like last year when they would get into a loss like that was really close on the road, they'd kind of just spin it out of control. And it feels like this year you see the post-game speeches, and Coach Gard does a great job of saying, hey, it's on the road. A game is a game. We split a hard road trip to LA, just got to win the next one. It's always focused on the next one, not focused on, hey, let's dwell on the past. So I really like that kind of, I guess, mentality shift from last year to this year.
Yeah, and they did, right? To your point, they went back and they won the next one. I also think you hit on the part that I think is really interesting is a lot of people, and myself included, talked about, listen, that defense wasn't great against UCLA, especially in the second half. I thought there were moments where the dribble penetration help was really poor. I went back and watched some of that. But the other part of this is Wisconsin dropped 80 plus on one of the better defenses in the Big Ten, a well-coached athletic defense. I think that's the other part that this offense is going to score on everybody, barring something crazy. And that's a carrying card for this offense.
No, I agree. I think it's one of those games that you can afford to drop. It's a quad one loss on the road, and it's a game that metrics didn't have you projected to win, which so means the net rankings and KenPom, all those ones that are predictive of where you're going to finish. Wisconsin didn't move at all. In fact, I think one of them they actually moved up because they were better in the game than people expected. And then you see they play a team like Nebraska. They were only projected to win by 8 or 9. They beat them by 28. They move up like 6 spots. It just shows that you need to win the games you're supposed to win. Losing the games you're not supposed to win, it's not the end of the world. So I like how this team is regrouped well, clearly after the Nebraska game.
Let's finish on this with basketball, and then one more topic I want to get into. What's the realistic ceiling on this team for you?
That's a good question. I was looking at some of the brackets today just to see where Wisconsin was being put, and I saw a mix of 4 and 5 seeds. I think if they're a 4 seed, their ceiling might be a little bit higher just because it would be a little bit of an easier path, I think. But even if they're a 5, I think this team – I mean, if my expectation of this team is I think they should at least make the round of 32, if not the Sweet 16. I could easily see an Elite 8 run from this team just because you look at the metrics – it's not like they're atrocious defensively. They're just not to Wisconsin standards, but they're still 46th, I believe, in the country. It just shows that the defense is there. They just need to continue to work on it. And they're 4th best in the Big Ten play in defense. So it shows that they have ramped it up as the more important conference opponents have started to come on their schedule. I just feel like this team is much better put together than last season, just because it felt like last season when guys like AJ Storr or Chucky weren't able to create anything for themselves, felt like the just offense was all out of sorts. And it feels like this year, the fact is that guys like Tanjay, Blackwell, even Klesmit, Crowell, or Winter can all go off on any singular night. And it shows that this team does not have to rely on one singular player. And while Tanjay and Blackwell might be the best player, it doesn't show that they have to go off. We saw in I know I'm going off track, but we saw in the USC game, Tanjay had 0 points. They still won by double digits, nearly 20 points. That just shows that this team is not built on one specific player that needs to, I guess, catalyze this offense to have a necessary run.
Yeah, I love that point because it makes it really hard to defend ultimately. All right, we're going to take one more quick second here. Come back. We're going to talk about where does Billy Edwards Jr. rank among Big Ten starting quarterbacks next season. We're going to talk about that next on Locked On Badgers. First, a quick second for our friends of the show. And a quick second to say thank you for everybody tuning in. We're coming right back with Connor here. Yeah, that was an abbreviated break, Connor. I want to hit this because one of the things that following you and what you do on Bucky Smith's Quarter, you put out a lot of content, football and basketball, and you had a really good article about where Billy Edwards Jr. might rank among all Big Ten quarterbacks next year. First of all, how else can people follow your work? I want to start there, and then let's talk about that article.
I appreciate it. I post everything I write on my Twitter account, which is at _Connor_W. So pretty much everything I write is on there, whether that be on Substack. I write some of my own personal stuff on there, and a lot of my main stuff will be on Bucky's Fifth Quarter. So you can find me both those places, but I'd say mainly just look at my Twitter because I don't want you guys looking in the wrong places for something that might not be there. So I usually post it pretty regularly on my stream, so you can look there for pretty much anything I do.
All right, let's jump into your quarterback article where you had Billy Edwards Jr. as 8th among Big Ten quarterbacks, projected Big Ten quarterbacks next year. I think that's interesting because if you go back and look at who per quarterback rating would have been 8th last year, it would have been Ethan Garbers, UCLA. And if you go and look at those numbers and kind of compare them to what we had this year, I mean, Garbers was 65% completion percentage, 16 touchdowns, 11 picks. That's a big jump up from Braden Locke. My bigger point is just going from where we were to middle pack Big Ten. That's a big jump in numbers.
I also do think that I like your point about being Ethan Garbers. I do think that the Big Ten will be much deeper quarterback-wise this year, so I do think that he would be a step up, a guy like Ethan Garbers. But I'm looking more at a guy like, I'd say, a little bit lower than what Luke Allmeyer was last year. I think I wrote about that in my article. I think that a guy that shows rushing capabilities, throws maybe 17 to 20 touchdowns, like high teens to low 20s, amount of touchdowns, not a ton amount of picks, but also just kind of pretty accurate. And I feel like that's what Wisconsin needs, and that's also what they're going to ask of Billy Edwards. So I believe I had him at 8th in my ranking, which I feel like is pretty fair, just because there's a lot of unknowns in the Big Ten. I feel like there's a lot of guys and a lot of teams that are going to be trotting out guys that we haven't seen much of yet. So I kind of had him middle of the pack just because he was pretty almost middle of the pack this season at Maryland. I feel like with a jump in talent I feel like at running back and coaching and even receiver this year, I feel like he might be able to make that jump just naturally. But I also feel like the fact is that Wisconsin, if they had league average quarterback play last year, they could have been a 7-8 win team, because that's how many close games they had against these big opponents. And that just shows, imagine a Luke Fickell who's getting a little bit of heat now for not making a bowl game, won 8 games last year, or even 7. With that schedule, people would be really impressed, I feel like. And that just shows that he made the necessary adjustments. I'm not trying to blame all of it on Braden Locke. It's not completely all his fault. It just shows that if they had a little bit of an uptick in quarterback play, the ceiling of that team would have been much higher last season.
Let me ask you this, and I didn't ask you this prior. I never try to actually shotgun people, but sometimes
No,
I do questions in the middle of a show.
For sure.
So Tanner Mordecai came in. I mean, I was excited about it. I talked about, hey, big numbers, he can run, he's going to help. Didn't work out great. Obviously, injury in there, but even when he played, it wasn't exactly what we expected. Tyler Van Dyke came in, got hurt early, but even in those first 2 games, we had thought this guy's going to push the ball down the field. Like, we're going to see a more explosive vertical offense, and it didn't look like that was happening either. Why should Badger fans be excited about transfer quarterback number 3? Why is it different with Edwards, if it is?
I mean, I'll tell everyone, I'm a writer about Wisconsin, but at the same time, I'm a student here. So I do root for them to do well. And I'm not trying to root for anything bad so I can have more content. I really hope that the team does well. And the thing I look at Billy Edwards is just his ability to run. And I know that guys like Tyler Van Dyke and Tanner Mordecai have had some rushing ability, but not a ton prior to them coming to Madison, which I think is the biggest thing here. I was watching a thing with, I think, Matt LePay and Jeff Grimes about his journey to Madison and what he was looking for in a quarterback. And I thought he said it really well, that he wants a guy that comes in with already established mobility, because what I think Phil Longo did that I didn't love is that he'd bring in guys with the arm strength and try to develop their mobility. And I feel like all that led to was 2 huge quarterback injuries, which led to a lot of bad quarterback play because they threw in a guy that wasn't expected to be a starter. It feels like this year you have a guy coming in that already was a Big Ten starter, played pretty well at Maryland, and the tape stands out that he could be even better. Maryland's offensive line ranked, I believe, dead last in the Big Ten, and we know that Wisconsin's offensive line has been really good with Coach A.J. Blazik. And I feel like with an uptick in offensive line production and just better coaching, and I guess a scheme that fits him better, I think he can be really accurate, because they're not going to ask him to just throw deep downfield as much as other teams might, because they want to establish a strong rushing attack. But it also allows for more RPOs and those kind of offensive, I guess, plays that Longo was trying to run in the beginning of his tenure, but he wasn't able to because Locke wasn't as capable with his legs. But a guy like Billy Edwards wants to put his body on the line. I remember the first moment I learned about Billy Edwards was against Michigan 2023. He had 3 quarterback sneaks and 3 touchdowns in that game, I believe what it was. His body was put on the line instead of Talia Tagovailoa. It just shows that he tries to run as much as possible, but also has the arm talent to do it. And I feel like he fits the Wisconsin identity that they want to establish so much better than guys like Mordecai and Van Dyke. And I also think that Grimes is just a much better fit because he reminds me more of the Denbrocks and even the Gino Guidugli's of the world, rather than Phil Longo, who's bringing a completely different system to Fickell, who didn't really mesh with it very well.
I think that's well said. It kind of reminds me of Wisconsin last year. You mentioned it's not all on Locke. It's also, you have Longo and all these other things that were going on. It kind of reminds me of Gordon Ramsay, and he does like these restaurant rescue shows, and he comes in, he's like, this is crap and this is crap. This whole thing needed a makeover, right? And I think that's why it's going to work a little bit better. I think we have a better fit at OC. I think we have more experienced running backs. I think we finally found our offensive line coach, and now he's in a second year where he's developing these guys. Now you have a quarterback that also fits that better. It's like you've changed the restaurant, but the paint, the everything, the menu, the restaurant, the cook, everything's been swapped out, and it feels like like a more cohesive fit just in totality. And I guess what I'm saying is Edwards can come in and really raise the quarterback level play, but some of that is going to be because of Grimes, and some of that is going to be because of the offensive line is in the second year under Blazik. Some of that's going to be because of Jones and Dupree are in their second year. Some of it's going to be because of Kozio, right? There's just more things here that make sense.
I agree. I think Kozio is a great point. I know I saw his tweet today. Everyone's excited because it was his birthday, and people are talking about how excited they are to see him play here. And I think it's going to be huge because I think teams like Michigan have shown that even this season, Davis Warren was not a guy that should have led them to 7 or 8 wins, but he did. And the main reason for that was Colston Loveland. Having a tight end as a safety valve for even a guy like Billy Edwards, who's already pretty established, just shows that you have a much higher floor than even last season. Because it felt like last season they would run, I feel like 11 personnel, and it just felt like it didn't, or even it'd be 10 personnel, I believe, sometimes, where it just felt like it's just such a air raid offense that didn't fit the style of play that Fickell was trying to run at Wisconsin. It just felt like even the receivers that we had didn't really fit the style of air raid that I think Lungo wanted to bring to Wisconsin. And guys like Will Pauling were really talented in the slot, but sometimes you need a deep threat guy. And if Vinny Anthony is the only deep threat, it felt like the kind of New Year game plan already. So you kind of became a one-trick pony when it came to offensive game playing by the end of the season, which is why they struggled against teams like Nebraska and Minnesota, in my opinion.
Really quick shotgun questions here to get you on the way out the door. Who is the leading rusher next year?
That's a great question. I know we were talking about this before the podcast, and I kind of have I'll kind of flip the question a little bit. I think that Dupree and Dilon Jones are nearly going to be neck and neck. I think it's going to be very similar to the tandem that Penn State has going right now with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, because I think they both came in as highly touted freshmen, both played a lot in their freshman year, so not the same situation, but still both were seen as the two biggest weapons in that offensive, offensive skill position room. And I feel like next year, guys like Dupree and Dilon Jones could both run for like 700, 800 yards. I think Dupree will be the main back just because he had more playing time this season, but I don't think that'd be more. I think he'd only lead in yards by like 40 or 50 over Jones, just the way I've seen Jones play. I think he's almost as talented, if not as talented. I feel like that would be a really nice 1-2 punch that could really make some noise in the Big Ten this season.
Yeah, I like Jones a lot. I think Dupree, you got to lean Dupree. Same running back coach, and that's the running back coach that had Dupree ahead of Jones anyway. So I think you lean to him. Leading receiver, we'll go catches. And you can throw tight ends in here if you want.
I'm thinking about it. I'd say leading receiver in catches, I'd probably say Kozio, just because I know Billy Edwards and him already have a little bit of a relationship prior to becoming to Madison. I believe they were at a camp or something together. I'm not completely sure, but I saw they had kind of some interactions before coming to Madison. I think that connection might be good. But I'd say a guy like Mark Camper might be up there just because he's so consistent, because he can be either in the slot or deep. And I feel like a guy like Tretch might just be stuck in the slot, which means we don't really know how it's going to play because he's going to be his first season starting in the slot. And a guy like Vinny Anthony might just be 1 or 2 catch a game, but it's for a long catch. So I feel like a guy like Camper could lead, but I'll say Kozio just because it's the safest option.
Yeah, I was between Kozio and VA, actually. I think Vinny could be in line for a few more catches this year, but he is more of a boom-bust type of guy. I think I'm going to go Vinny, though. Last one here, leading TFL guy on defense.
I'm going to say Tackett Curtis. I really liked in this limited moments he played this season. I know that he had some not great plays this season. I remember he got some flags when he really shouldn't have, and I think that just comes with time. As you mature as a college kid, you kind of become more disciplined when it comes to penalties and stuff like that. And I think in the limited times he played pretty well, and he is a really talented tackler. I think he's going to be a threat with Allegro up the middle.
Well, I'll say this. So I'm going to go with Christian on this one, Christian Allegro. But if Tackett comes to that level that you're talking about, then all of a sudden your inside linebackers are solved. That would be huge for that linebacker room for sure. He is Connor Whelan. Go check him out on his Twitter. Bucky's Fifth Quarter does great work as always. Second time on the show. Really do enjoy it. Hope we can do more of them. Connor, thank you so much, man, for jumping on.
Yeah, no problem. Loved it.
When you're done here, go check out Locked On Big Ten. All the biggest stories from the conference over on that channel. Squad shows over there. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, great content coming up this week, including a guest you're not going to want to miss on Wisconsin, and we will talk later.